Atlas wouldn't stop pawing the same patch of concrete, and the men arriving through the trees looked far more interested in it than the rusted hut itself. A steel door slammed somewhere outside, and Ethan dropped to one knee without thinking, his pulse racing before his mind caught up. Atlas stood frozen, ears locked on a dark corner of the floor, letting out one low growl that echoed through the empty hut. Then came the sound of boots crunching across wet gravel, and someone whispered, "It's under here. What do you think they're really looking for?" The first thing Ethan Brooks did every morning was check on Atlas, before he checked his own wallet, before he looked at the fuel gauge, before he wondered where they would park that night. The German Shepherd lifted his head from the worn blanket spread across the back seat of the aging Ford pickup. His amber eyes met Ethan's for a long second, before his tail tapped softly against the truck bed.
You all right, buddy? We're almost
"You still with me?" Ethan asked. Atlas answered by climbing forward and resting his heavy head against Ethan's shoulder. Outside, dawn crept across a grocery store parking lot on the edge of Missoula, Montana. The pavement shimmered from a night of freezing rain, and the mountains beyond town stood dark against a pale blue sky. Another morning, another place they had to leave before anyone complained. Ethan rubbed the stiffness from his neck. Sleeping in the driver's seat never became easier. At 38, his back reminded him of every hard landing he'd ever taken overseas. His army duffel sat behind the seat, faded and patched. It held everything that remained of his life. 3 shirts, a shaving kit, a worn photograph of 4 young soldiers laughing beside a dusty Humvee somewhere in eastern Afghanistan. Only one man in that picture had made it home without a folded flag. Atlas nudged his arm again. "I'm moving." He reached for the small bag of dog food before opening the last can of cold beans for himself. The dog ate first, always. That habit had started years ago in Afghanistan, when military working dogs often worked longer than the men beside them. Some habits never left. Neither did some memories. A delivery truck slammed its cargo door somewhere across the parking lot. The sharp metallic bang echoed through the cold morning air. Ethan froze. His breathing stopped. For a heartbeat, he wasn't in Montana anymore. Dust. Heat. Someone shouting, "Contact left!" The heavy door of a Humvee crashing shut before a convoy rolled toward an uncertain village. His eyes swept automatically across rooftops, tree lines, parked vehicles, searching for threats that no longer existed. Atlas immediately stood, without barking, without panic. The dog pressed firmly against Ethan's leg until the tightness in his shoulders slowly eased. The grocery truck pulled away. The parking lot became quiet again. Ethan exhaled. False alarm. His voice sounded almost embarrassed. Atlas simply watched him. Dogs never asked questions soldiers couldn't answer. After breakfast, Ethan counted his money. $21.38. Enough for another day or two if nothing went wrong. Everything usually went wrong. 3 weeks earlier, the warehouse where he'd worked overnight security had cut staff after losing a government contract. The manager had apologized. The landlord hadn't. By the end of the month, Ethan was living inside the truck. He'd stopped calling old friends. Most had families now. Some still carried burdens heavier than his own. He wasn't going to become another phone call asking for help. Around noon, his prepaid phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost ignored it. "Mr. Brooks?" The woman's voice sounded calm and professional. "This is Grace Holloway with Holloway Legal Services in Hamilton. I think you've got the wrong number." "I don't believe so. I'm calling regarding your uncle, Thomas Brooks." Ethan frowned. "My uncle?" "Yes." Silence stretched between them. "I wasn't aware you had contact with him," Grace continued gently. "I didn't." His uncle had disappeared from family gatherings long before Ethan enlisted. People simply said Thomas liked mountains more than people. No one ever explained further. "I'm afraid your uncle passed away 2 weeks ago." Ethan looked through the windshield toward the distant mountains. "I'm sorry to hear that. He left instructions that you be contacted. I don't have money for lawyers. This isn't about payment." Another pause. "You've inherited property." Ethan almost laughed. "I think you have the wrong Brooks. A parcel of land in the Bitterroot Mountains. I can't afford property taxes. The unpaid taxes total exactly $10. This time he did laugh. Not because it was funny. Because it sounded impossible. "What kind of property costs $10? "It doesn't," Grace answered honestly. "The taxes do." She explained there was no electricity, no road access, no registered residence except an abandoned steel hut built decades earlier. Most heirs would refuse it. Thomas Brooks had believed Ethan wouldn't. Before hanging up, she added quietly, "If you're willing to come tomorrow, I'll explain everything." The drive south used nearly a quarter tank of gasoline. Atlas watched pine forests slide past the windows, while Ethan wondered if he was wasting his last chance. By late afternoon, they reached Hamilton. Grace's office occupied the second floor of a century-old brick building overlooking Main Street. Inside, everything smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. Grace Holloway appeared younger than Ethan expected, perhaps in her early 40s, dressed simply in a navy blazer with silver reading glasses resting atop a stack of files. She studied Ethan for only a second before her eyes shifted toward Atlas. So this must be him. Ethan blinked. "You knew about Atlas? Your uncle mentioned him." She opened a folder thick with legal documents. "Thomas followed your military career from a distance. I never knew. He preferred it that way." Grace slid a deed across the desk. Several maps followed, then an envelope. Finally, she held up a rusted iron key. Its surface was dark with age, worn smooth where countless fingers had once gripped it. Ethan signed the paperwork almost mechanically. When everything was finished, he reached into his pocket. He unfolded a wrinkled $10 bill, his last paper bill. Grace accepted it without a word. Then she placed the old iron key into his hand. It felt unexpectedly heavy, almost warm. As Ethan stood to leave, Grace looked toward Atlas, who had quietly remained beside the door the entire time. "There was one final instruction," she said. Ethan stopped. Grace's expression softened. "Your uncle told me that if you ever made it here..." She glanced once more at the German shepherd before meeting Ethan's eyes. "Tell him to trust the dog more than the map." The words lingered long after Ethan stepped out of Grace Holloway's office. The old iron key rested in his jacket pocket, heavy enough that he kept reaching down to make sure it was still there. Atlas walked beside him through the quiet streets of Hamilton, his ears forward, his pace steady, as though he had already accepted whatever waited in the mountains. Ethan hadn't. By late afternoon, he stopped at a gas station on the edge of town. The truck swallowed nearly the last of his money. When the pump clicked off, the fuel gauge still sat below half. He stared at it for a long moment. "This better be worth $10, he muttered. Atlas answered with a soft huff through the open passenger window. The paved highway gradually narrowed into a winding mountain road. Dense forests closed around them, towering ponderosa pines stretching high enough to hide most of the sky. Snow still clung to the shadows beneath the trees, even though spring had already reached the valleys below. Grace's map directed him onto an old logging road, or what had once been a logging road. Deep ruts twisted through thick mud. Fallen branches blocked parts of the trail. More than once, Ethan had to climb out with a folding saw from his truck to clear a path wide enough to squeeze through. The farther they drove, the quieter the world became. No radio stations, no passing traffic, no cell service. Only the rumble of the old engine and the occasional cry of a hawk circling above the ridgeline. Ethan slowed instinctively as the road climbed higher. His eyes moved constantly. High ground, escape routes, fresh tire tracks, broken brush, old habits. At one bend, he noticed a section of crushed grass beside the road. Someone had driven through recently. Not today. Maybe a week ago. The impressions had softened under rain, but they were still visible. He climbed out and crouched beside them. Atlas joined him without command, sniffing quietly before lifting his nose toward the trees. Heavy pickup, Ethan murmured. The tread looked too aggressive for ordinary tourists. Logging tires. Maybe, maybe not. He stood again. Let's keep moving. Another mile brought them to a washed-out section where the road simply disappeared into a rocky creek bed. Beyond that point, driving was impossible. Ethan shut off the engine. Silence rushed in immediately. He loaded his backpack, a canteen, a flashlight, a first aid kit left over from his security job, a sleeping bag, the old key. Atlas waited patiently beside the truck. You ready? The dog's tail moved once. The trail climbed steadily through thick timber. Hours passed beneath whispering pine branches. Sometimes Ethan checked the map. Sometimes he ignored it. Atlas often walked several yards ahead, only stopping whenever Ethan fell too far behind. Near sunset, the forest suddenly opened. A small clearing appeared between the trees, and there it stood. The hut. At first glance, it looked less like a building than the rusted shell of an abandoned railroad car. Its curved steel roof sagged beneath years of snow. Orange streaks of rust covered nearly every panel. Several narrow windows had shattered decades ago. Young birch trees had begun growing against one side as if the mountain itself intended to reclaim it. No smoke, no footprints, no sign of life. Ethan let out a slow breath. So that's what $10 buys. The disappointment settled quietly. He hadn't expected luxury, but he had hoped for something less forgotten. Atlas ignored the doorway completely. Instead, the German shepherd circled the structure once, then again. His nose stayed close to the ground. Every few steps he paused, sniffed carefully, and continued. What is it? The dog didn't answer. He stopped beside the north wall, sniffed, moved on, then reached the front entrance. The heavy steel door hung crooked on massive hinges. A rusted chain wrapped through two handles. The padlock matched the old key almost perfectly. Ethan pulled the key from his pocket. Its teeth slid into the lock with surprising ease. He turned. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. He leaned harder. Metal groaned. For one tense second he thought the key might snap. Then, clunk. The lock released. The chain dropped heavily against the steel door. Its echo rolled through the trees. The sound hit Ethan like a rifle crack. His muscles tightened instantly. Before he realized it, he had shifted sideways, lowering his shoulders, scanning the surrounding timber. Tree line, ridge line, dead ground. No movement. His breathing slowed only after Atlas pressed gently against his knee. Easy, Ethan whispered. You're home. He wasn't sure whether he was speaking to the dog or to himself. Together they pulled the heavy door open. The hinges screamed after years of silence. Cold air drifted out carrying the smell of damp steel, old wood, and dust. Inside, fading sunlight slipped through a narrow crack high in the roof. Thousands of tiny dust particles floated through the beam like slow-falling snow. The space was enormous, empty. Concrete floor, bare steel ribs, nothing else. No furniture, no supplies, no hidden fortune. Just silence. Ethan stood there for nearly a minute. His shoulders sagged. Maybe Grace had been right. Maybe everyone else had been right. Maybe this place really was worthless. He stepped inside. His boots echoed across the concrete. Atlas followed, then suddenly stopped. The German shepherd turned away from Ethan. Slowly, deliberately. His eyes locked onto one corner of the floor near the far wall. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stood perfectly still, staring at the same spot. Ethan waited. Atlas had spent years detecting explosives, hidden compartments, and people buried beneath collapsed buildings during training exercises. The dog never fixated without a reason. "What do you see, buddy?" Atlas didn't move. His ears stayed forward. His nose twitched once. Then he looked briefly at Ethan, before turning his attention back to the same corner of the concrete floor. The beam of evening sunlight barely reached it. Ethan crossed the empty hut slowly, placing each boot carefully. The silence inside magnified every footstep. The concrete looked no different from the rest of the floor, except for a layer of dirt that seemed slightly thinner near the wall. He crouched and brushed away years of dust with the sleeve of his jacket. Nothing. Just old concrete. Atlas lowered his nose until it nearly touched the floor. He sniffed again, then gently tapped the surface with one paw. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan smiled faintly. "You've got better instincts than I do." He reached for the small pry bar strapped inside his backpack and tested the edge of the concrete where it met the steel wall. No hidden hatch, no loose panel. Nothing gave way. Whatever Atlas sensed wasn't obvious. Outside, daylight faded quickly beneath the towering pines. The mountains swallowed the sun long before evening reached the valleys. "We're losing light." Reluctantly, Ethan stood. "If it's still here tomorrow, we'll figure it out." Atlas hesitated before finally stepping away. That alone told Ethan something important. The dog wasn't distracted. He was waiting. The first priority became survival. The hut offered no insulation, but it blocked the wind. Ethan gathered broken branches from around the clearing and fed them into an old rusted fire ring just outside the entrance. Soon, a small fire crackled beneath the darkening sky. He heated a can of beef stew over the flames. Atlas lay nearby, never taking his eyes completely off the building. Night settled over the Bitterroot Mountains with startling speed. The stars appeared one by one until the sky seemed crowded with them. Far away, a coyote called. Another answered. Ethan finished eating and spread his sleeping bag on the cleanest patch of concrete he could find. Atlas curled beside him. "You've slept in worse places." The dog's ears twitched. "So have I." Sleep didn't come easily. It rarely did. Sometime after midnight, a gust of wind struck the steel walls. The entire hut groaned. A loose sheet of metal clanged sharply against another. The sound exploded through Ethan's mind. His eyes flew open. He rolled instinctively behind an old support beam, one hand reaching for the flashlight clipped beside his sleeping bag before he fully understood where he was. His breathing shortened. Somewhere in his memory, rotor blades, dust swirling beneath helicopter lights, an LZ outside Kandahar, a medic shouting over the radio. Then another metallic bang echoed through the hut. Atlas was already standing, not barking, watching Ethan. The dog stepped forward and pressed his muzzle firmly against Ethan's shoulder. The trembling in Ethan's breathing slowly eased. He blinked several times. The helicopter disappeared. The mountains returned. "Sorry." His voice sounded hoarse. "I know." Atlas remained beside him until Ethan finally lowered the flashlight. Neither of them slept much after that. Morning arrived quietly. Golden light spilled through the broken windows, warming patches of the concrete floor. After eating the last energy bar in his pack, Ethan decided to inspect the building more carefully before returning to town for supplies. The hut looked abandoned, but abandoned places always told stories. You simply had to know where to look. He examined the steel ribs supporting the curved roof. Most remained solid. Surface rust, nothing catastrophic. The roof itself leaked in 3 places. Repairable. The hinges needed grease. Several window frames could be rebuilt. As he moved along the rear wall, something caught his eye. A wooden cabinet nearly hidden beneath a collapsed shelf. Its door had swollen from moisture. After several hard pulls, it finally opened. Inside rested a waterproof military-style storage case. Olive green. Scratched. Still sealed. Ethan frowned. This wasn't here by accident. He carried it into the sunlight. The rubber gasket resisted before finally releasing with a dull pop. Inside lay several carefully wrapped notebooks, a folded measuring tape, hand-drawn sketches, survey notes, and one leather-bound journal. Its cover bore a single name burned into the leather. Thomas Brooks. Ethan sat down cross-legged on the floor. The first pages contained dates stretching back almost 25 years. No personal stories, just observations, weather patterns, snow depth, water flow, wildlife, timber conditions. Everything written in neat block letters. Further in, the entries changed. Simple diagrams filled entire pages, cross-sections of the hut, measurements between support beams, ventilation calculations, rainwater collection, emergency food storage, solar battery placement. Thomas hadn't owned this place merely to live here. He had been planning something. Page after page described improvements to what he repeatedly called the haven. Not a cabin, not a bunker. Simply, the haven. Ethan turned another page. The writing became more personal. If you're reading this, one paragraph began, then you stayed long enough to start asking the right questions. A faint smile crossed Ethan's face. You knew I'd snoop. Atlas wandered over and settled beside him. Ethan scratched behind the dog's ears while continuing to read. The journal described hidden water lines, natural drainage, fire protection, food caches. Yet every time it referenced the heart of the project, the instructions abruptly stopped. Instead, Thomas always wrote the same sentence, "Not here." Ethan flipped through every remaining page. Nothing. No map. No location. Only sketches that seemed deliberately incomplete. Until he reached the final page. There, in darker ink, Thomas had written only a single line. The one sentence that made Ethan slowly lower the journal and look toward Atlas. The one who knows the entrance will never be human. Ethan read the sentence 3 more times before closing the journal. Atlas sat beside him, watching quietly. The German shepherd wasn't looking at the journal. He was watching Ethan, as if waiting to see whether the man would finally understand. Ethan rested the leather notebook on his knee and looked around the empty steel hut. No map, he murmured. No directions. Only the sound of wind slipping through rusted seams answered him. He stood and walked once more to the corner where Atlas had stopped the day before. The dog followed but didn't paw at the floor this time. He simply sniffed once, then looked back toward the open doorway. Ethan frowned. So you're telling me to wait? Atlas blinked. It wasn't the answer Ethan wanted, but over the years he'd learned something about working beside military dogs. When they stopped searching, there was usually a reason. Sometimes they were waiting for conditions to change. Sometimes they wanted their handler to notice something else first. Ethan slipped the journal into his backpack. The hut could wait. If he intended to stay here, he needed supplies before anything else. The truck was nearly an hour's hike away. By mid-morning, He was driving back toward Hamilton, with Atlas riding quietly beside him. The small mountain town looked different in daylight. Flower boxes hung beneath old storefront windows. Pickup trucks lined Main Street. People waved to one another by name. It was the kind of place where strangers were noticed immediately. As Ethan parked outside a hardware store, several conversations paused just long enough for curious eyes to follow the dusty Ford. The wooden sign above the entrance read, "Turner Hardware." A small brass bell jingled overhead as Ethan stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Fresh-cut lumber, machine oil, leather gloves, coffee. Behind the counter stood a broad-shouldered older man with silver hair tucked beneath a faded Marine Corps cap. He looked up from sharpening a handplane. Morning. Morning. The man's eyes lingered briefly on Ethan's posture, then on Atlas, then on the faded army tattoo visible beneath Ethan's rolled sleeve. Afghanistan? Ethan nodded once. The older man smiled slightly. Gulf War. He extended a calloused hand. Caleb Turner. Ethan Brooks. Their handshake was firm. Neither man squeezed harder than necessary. Veterans recognized each other that way. No speeches, no explanations, just understanding. What can I help you with? Ethan unfolded the rough list he'd made that morning. Roof patch, roofing tar, hammer, nails, lantern fuel, rope, basic plumbing fittings. Caleb read it without interrupting. You fixing up the old Brooks place? I guess I am. Haven't heard anyone say that in years. You knew my uncle? Caleb chuckled. Everybody knew Thomas. What was he like? The old man thought for a moment. Quiet, helpful, built things nobody else thought were worth building. Spent more time in the mountains than in town. He handed Ethan a box of galvanized nails. Never wasted words. That sounded familiar. As Caleb gathered supplies, a woman pushing a shopping cart slowed near the register. She glanced toward Ethan. You're really staying up there? I'll try. She exchanged a look with Caleb. You'll want extra blankets. Another customer laughed softly. And plenty of firewood. Ethan smiled politely. Nobody sounded cruel, just doubtful. The cashier rang up the supplies. Ethan counted every dollar carefully. By the time he finished paying, only a handful of bills remained folded inside his wallet. Caleb quietly placed a pair of heavy leather work gloves on the counter. You forgot these. I didn't. I can't afford. They're used. Ethan looked down. The gloves had clearly seen years of work, but the stitching remained solid. I can't just take them. Caleb shrugged, then borrow them. After a pause, Ethan accepted. Thank you. As he loaded everything into the truck, Atlas suddenly lifted his head. The dog's ears turned toward the eastern hills. He sniffed once, then again. Without warning, he jumped from the truck and trotted across the road toward a narrow trail, disappearing behind an abandoned grain shed. Atlas! The dog kept going, not running, leading. Ethan hurried after him. The trail wound only a few hundred yards before ending beside a shallow depression lined with moss-covered stones. A trickle of water slipped quietly between them, barely visible. Atlas began digging beside an old cedar stump. Within seconds, his paws uncovered the end of a rusted metal pipe. Ethan knelt. He cleared away more dirt with his hands. The pipe continued underground toward the mountains. He unscrewed the cracked cap. Clean water spilled steadily into the grass. Cold, crystal clear. He cupped his hands and tasted it. Fresh spring water. His eyes widened. This wasn't on the map. Atlas wagged his tail once. Ethan looked uphill. If the pipe still carried water after all these years, someone had built an entire gravity-fed system. His uncle, the journal, the haven. Pieces were beginning to fit together. Back at the truck, Caleb was waiting with 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you'd find that old spring sooner or later." Ethan looked surprised. "You knew about it?" Caleb nodded. "Thomas spent 2 summers laying pipe through those woods. Never told anybody where it ended." He handed Ethan one of the cups. "You'll learn something about this mountain." "What's that?" "It doesn't give away its secrets. It lets people earn them." That night, Ethan returned to the hut. He patched one section of the leaking roof before darkness settled across the clearing. Atlas lay near the doorway while Ethan stretched out inside his sleeping bag. The steel walls clicked softly as the temperature dropped. Sometime after midnight, a single branch snapped outside. Ethan's eyes opened instantly. He didn't sit up. He listened. Another sound. Not the wind. One step. Then silence. Atlas remained perfectly still. His ears stood forward into the darkness. Ethan didn't reach for the flashlight. Light worked both ways. It helped you see. It also helped others find you. Instead, he lay motionless inside his sleeping bag, slowing his breathing until the only sounds were the whisper of wind against the steel walls and the quiet crackle of dying embers outside. Another snap. Closer this time. Atlas shifted his weight without making a sound. His eyes stayed fixed on the doorway. Ethan slowly slid one hand toward the heavy hatchet resting beside his pack. It wasn't much of a weapon, but years in uniform had taught him that awareness mattered more than equipment. He counted silently. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Nothing. Then came a soft scrape of leather against bark. Someone was outside. Not an animal. Too careful. Too deliberate. Ethan waited another moment before giving Atlas the smallest hand signal. Stay. The German shepherd lowered himself immediately. Ethan slipped through the rear opening where a broken window frame had left enough room to crawl outside. Cold mountain air rushed over his face. He stayed low, using the shadow cast by the curved steel wall to hide his movement. His boots found patches of pine needles instead of dry twigs. No unnecessary noise. He circled toward the front of the hut. Empty. Only darkness and tall pines swaying gently. The clearing appeared deserted. He remained still another full minute before returning. Inside, Atlas relaxed only after Ethan crossed the doorway again. False alarm? The dog looked unconvinced. So was Ethan. Morning revealed what the darkness had hidden. Fresh boot prints. 2 separate sets, both larger than Ethan's. They crossed the clearing, stopped near the front entrance, then disappeared back toward the tree line. He knelt beside them. Deep tread. Heavy work boots, not hikers. The stride was measured, neither hurried nor aimless. Whoever had come here knew exactly where they were going. Atlas sniffed one print, then lifted his head toward the eastern ridge. Ethan photographed the tracks with his old phone before the morning sun softened the edges. He followed them for nearly 200 yards until they vanished onto rocky ground. No campsite. No vehicle. Nothing. Someone had wanted to visit unseen. The discovery stayed with him all the way back to town. Turner Hardware was already busy when Ethan arrived. Caleb looked up from repairing a chainsaw. You look like you didn't sleep. I didn't. Ethan showed him the photographs. Caleb studied them quietly. Not yours? No. Hunters. Ethan shook his head. Hunters don't usually approach a building before sunrise without carrying rifles. Caleb nodded slowly. You're right. He didn't elaborate. Instead, he walked toward the back of the store. When he returned, he carried a roll of bright survey tape and a box of old trail cameras. These don't record much anymore, he admitted, but they'll still take pictures if something walks by. I can't afford them. I didn't ask you to buy them. Ethan hesitated. I'll pay you back. You can, when that old place starts taking care of you. Before Ethan could answer, the bell above the front door jingled. A tall man in an expensive brown jacket stepped inside. Clean boots, pressed jeans, a polished pickup truck idled outside. The conversation in the store quieted almost immediately. Caleb's expression hardened by the smallest degree. "Ethan," he said softly, "meet Victor Sloan." The newcomer smiled. "Professional, practiced. You must be the veteran." Ethan extended a hand. Victor ignored it. "I hear you inherited the Brooks property." "I did." Victor glanced toward the mountain visible through the front window. "That's a lonely piece of land. It suits me." A faint smile crossed Victor's face. "I own most of the timber contracts north of there. So I've heard. I'd like to make you an offer." Ethan folded the photographs and slipped them into his pocket. "I'm listening." $25,000. Caleb stopped sorting bolts. The customer browsing paint quietly looked over. Ethan blinked once. "For a rusted hut?" "And the land." "I paid $10. Then you've already made an excellent investment." Victor's smile never changed. "You'll never make the place livable. No road, no utilities, no future. I'll save you years of frustration." Ethan studied him. In Afghanistan, he'd learned that people often revealed more through what they skipped than what they said. Victor never mentioned the timber, never mentioned the trees, never mentioned development. He wanted one thing. That exact property, not interested. Victor's smile faded slightly. "You should think about it." "I already have." The businessman reached into his pocket and handed Ethan a business card. "My offer won't stay this high forever." He turned and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he looked back once. Some places are better left alone. The bell jingled behind him. Silence filled the store. Caleb watched the truck disappear down Main Street. That man doesn't spend money unless he expects to make twice as much. "You know him well?" "I've known his type." Ethan slipped the business card into his wallet, without another word. Back at the hut that afternoon, he installed 2 of Caleb's old trail cameras overlooking the clearing. Atlas followed every step, occasionally stopping to sniff the air. While unloading roofing supplies, Ethan noticed something glinting beneath a clump of grass near the entrance. A strand of new barbed wire. It hadn't been there yesterday. He crouched beside it. The wire had been stretched low between 2 bushes, almost invisible. A trip line. Not enough to stop a man. Enough to send someone crashing onto sharp rocks. Atlas approached, sniffed once, then carefully stepped over it before looking back at Ethan. Someone hadn't just visited. Someone had begun preparing the clearing. As Ethan cut the wire free with a pair of pliers, Atlas suddenly lunged toward the trees. A sharp yelp echoed through the clearing. The German shepherd stumbled back. A fresh line of blood appeared across his right shoulder where hidden barbed wire had caught him. "Atlas!" Ethan dropped everything and knelt beside him. The wound wasn't deep, but it was deliberate. Someone had started turning the mountain itself into a trap. Ethan lowered himself onto one knee, gently running his fingers through the thick fur around Atlas's shoulder. The cut wasn't deep. The barbed wire had sliced through skin, but missed the muscle beneath. Lucky. Very lucky. Easy, buddy. Atlas didn't pull away. He sat perfectly still while Ethan opened the old military first aid kit he carried everywhere. The antiseptic stung. The German shepherd flinched only once. Not a whimper. Not a growl. just a slight tightening around his eyes, before Ethan wrapped the wound with clean gauze. "You've been tougher than me for years," Atlas answered by pressing his nose against Ethan's chest. The simple gesture carried more comfort than words ever could. Ethan looked toward the tree line again. Whoever had stretched that wire hadn't intended to hunt deer. It had been placed exactly where someone walking from the truck toward the hut would naturally pass. It wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to send a message. "Leave." He picked up the severed strand of barbed wire and rolled it carefully into a coil before slipping it into the truck. Evidence. Old habits again. That afternoon, Ethan stopped looking over his shoulder every few minutes. Instead, he got to work. Fear had kept him alive overseas, but purpose had always carried him forward. The roof came first. Thomas's journal listed every weak section using measurements instead of room names. Support rib 6. Panel 9. Western seam. The old man had documented everything with the precision of an engineer. Ethan climbed carefully across the curved steel roof, replacing rusted fasteners one at a time. Atlas remained below, pacing the clearing. Every few minutes the dog stopped to scan the woods before continuing his slow patrol. Not once did he wander far. Late in the afternoon, Ethan heard a truck approaching. He climbed down cautiously. Instead of Victor Sloan, he found Caleb Turner driving an aging flatbed loaded with reclaimed lumber. "I figured you'd need more than nails." Ethan smiled for the first time in days. "You drove all the way out here?" Caleb shrugged. "I've been retired long enough to waste time helping stubborn people." Together they unloaded weathered beams salvaged from an old church outside town. The wood was dry, straight, and stronger than anything Ethan could have afforded. "You don't owe me," Caleb said before Ethan could speak. "You'll pay it forward someday." While they worked, Atlas disappeared behind the hut. A moment later he barked once. Short, sharp, not alarm, attention. Both men walked around the building. Atlas stood beside a shallow depression where moss covered several flat stones. The German shepherd scratched gently at the ground, not digging wildly, showing. Caleb knelt beside him. "I'll be..." He brushed away years of pine needles. A narrow iron pipe emerged beneath the soil. Caleb laughed quietly. Thomas actually did it. "What?" "He ran spring water all the way here." Ethan followed the pipe toward the hut. It disappeared beneath the foundation. Back inside, after moving a pile of rusted sheet metal, they discovered an old shut-off valve hidden behind loose boards. Ethan turned it carefully. Nothing. He tried again. A loud cough echoed through the pipe. Then another. Finally, cold water burst from a rusted spigot mounted against the far wall. Brown at first, then clear, crystal clear. The stream splashed into an old metal bucket sitting beneath it, as though it had been waiting years for someone to open the valve again. Ethan stared. "You've got running water." Caleb smiled. "Gravity-fed. No electricity needed." Atlas walked over and lapped happily from the bucket. Ethan looked around the hut differently now. Yesterday he'd seen rust. Today, he saw planning. Every pipe, every support beam, every unusual measurement inside the journal suddenly made more sense. Thomas hadn't been building randomly. He'd been building layer by layer. As evening settled over the mountains, Caleb prepared to leave. He paused beside his truck. "One more thing." "What?" "If Victor Sloan comes back..." Ethan looked up. "Don't negotiate alone." "You know something." Caleb hesitated. "I know he buys land nobody else wants." "So?" "He usually already knows what's underneath before he makes an offer." The truck disappeared down the narrow road. Silence returned. That night, Ethan built his first real fire inside the old cast-iron stove he had uncovered beneath collapsed shelving earlier that day. It took nearly an hour to clean the flue, enough for smoke to draw properly. When the first flames finally caught, warm orange light danced across the curved steel walls. Atlas stretched beside the stove with a satisfied sigh. The hut no longer felt abandoned. It felt occupied. For the first time since losing his apartment, Ethan wasn't sleeping inside a truck. He sat cross-legged beside the fire and opened Thomas's journal again. Several new pages suddenly made sense. Water before walls, warmth before comfort, security before expansion. Thomas hadn't been writing construction notes. He'd been writing priorities. Exactly the same way Ethan's squad leaders had planned forward operating bases overseas. Establish water, secure shelter, create observation, expand only after survival. A strange smile crossed Ethan's face. You were military, not army, not Marines, but disciplined enough to think exactly the same way. Outside, darkness settled across the clearing. Inside, the stove crackled softly. Ethan closed the journal. Tomorrow he would begin framing the first interior wall. Tomorrow, he would stop surviving and start building. Across the room, Atlas suddenly lifted his head. Without barking, the German shepherd walked slowly to the same corner of the concrete floor. He lowered his nose, scratched the surface once, then twice, then looked directly at Ethan, before quietly lying down beside that exact spot. Ethan stared at the dog for several seconds. You've picked that corner 3 nights in a row. Atlas closed his eyes but never fully relaxed. The old military handler inside Ethan knew exactly what he was seeing. The dog wasn't interested in the concrete. He was guarding it. Whatever scent lingered there had become part of Atlas's mental picture of the building. Ethan picked up the pry bar again. He walked over and tapped the concrete. Solid. He tried another angle. Still solid. He measured the distance from the wall, comparing it to Thomas Brooks's sketches. The dimensions matched perfectly. Nothing looked out of place. He finally set the tool down. Not tonight. Atlas lifted his head as if satisfied. Outside, rain began with a light patter against the curved steel roof. Within minutes, it became a steady mountain storm. The repaired section held. Only 2 thin streams of water slipped through the older seams. Ethan smiled. Progress. He built the fire higher inside the cast-iron stove and unfolded another page from Thomas's journal. One line caught his attention. Observe before acting. Mountains reward patience. The sentence sounded less like construction advice and more like field doctrine. He remembered hearing something similar years earlier during a briefing outside Kandahar. Slow is smooth. Smooth is fast. His platoon sergeant had repeated it before every patrol. Rushing got people hurt. Observation kept them alive. Atlas suddenly raised his head, not toward the floor, toward the doorway. The dog's ears locked forward. His body became perfectly still. Ethan extinguished the lantern with one quick twist. Darkness swallowed the hut. Only the orange glow from the stove remained. Rain covered most sounds, but not all. A faint crunch. Boot. Another. Then the brief sweep of white light passed across one of the broken windows. Flashlight. Someone was outside. Ethan didn't move immediately. He counted. 1 beam. Disappeared. Returned from another angle. Not random. Searching. His heartbeat remained steady. Training replaced panic. He quietly reached beneath his cot and removed a small pair of binoculars. Instead of walking to the door, he slipped toward the opposite side of the hut, where a broken window offered a narrow view without exposing his silhouette. Atlas stayed low. No barking, no growling, only watching. A second flashlight appeared between the trees. Two people. They moved slowly, stopping every few yards, checking the ground. One pointed toward the hut. The other nodded. Ethan watched the pattern. They weren't hikers. They weren't lost. They were conducting a search. One of them stepped close enough for Ethan to make out the reflective stripe on a dark rain jacket. The man spoke quietly. The storm swallowed most of the words. Only one sentence drifted clearly through the rain. Under this place somewhere. Ethan's grip tightened around the binoculars. Under this place, not inside. Under. The man unfolded something. Paper. No. A survey map. The flashlight swept briefly across it before disappearing again. Atlas looked toward Ethan. One silent glance. The same look he had given countless times during training. Waiting. Ready. Ethan gave the smallest hand signal. Stay. The dog lowered himself immediately. Ethan slipped out through the rear opening exactly as he had practiced the previous night. Rain soaked his jacket within seconds. He stayed in the shadows behind the hut, moving one careful step at a time. Every placement mattered. Heel first, then toe. Avoid loose rock. Avoid branches. The storm became his camouflage. He circled until he could see both men from behind. Neither noticed him. Their attention remained fixed on the building. One carried a metal detector. The other held the folded survey map. So it's not the roof, one whispered. No. The old records put it below ground. The other cursed quietly. We're running out of time. A sharp bark exploded across the clearing. Atlas. Not loud. Just once. Both intruders spun toward the doorway instinctively. Exactly where Ethan wanted their attention. He stepped forward just enough for his boots to splash deliberately in a puddle. The men turned again. One flashlight swung directly toward him. For a split second, Ethan saw both faces beneath dripping hoods. Neither was Victor Sloan, but both wore jackets embroidered with the same company logo. Sloan Timber and Mineral. Who's there? Ethan answered calmly. The property owner. Silence. One man folded the survey map immediately. The other lowered his flashlight. We're on the wrong parcel. No, Ethan replied. I don't think you are. Without another word, the two men hurried back toward the trees. They didn't run. Professionals rarely did. Within seconds, the forest swallowed them. Atlas trotted over, nose already working the wet ground where they had stood. Ethan shined his flashlight after they were gone. Rain had blurred most of the footprints, but something remained. Near a patch of flattened grass lay a black handheld radio. One of the men had dropped it during the confusion. Beside it rested the folded survey map. Ethan picked both up carefully. The map was covered with contour lines and geological markings. One section had been circled repeatedly in red pencil. The circle didn't cover the forest. It didn't cover the stream. It centered on one place only. Thomas Brooks's rusted hut. As thunder rolled across the Bitterroot Mountains, Ethan looked back toward Atlas. The German shepherd was already standing once again over the same corner of the concrete floor. Now Ethan understood one thing with absolute certainty. Victor Sloan had never wanted to buy the land. He wanted whatever was hidden beneath it. Ethan spread the damp survey map across the old workbench inside the hut. Rain drummed steadily on the steel roof while Atlas lay nearby, his bandaged shoulder resting on the floor. Every few minutes, the German shepherd lifted his head toward the same corner of the building before settling again. The red circle on the map wasn't large. It covered only the hut itself. No trees, no stream, no logging roads. Just the structure Thomas Brooks had spent decades protecting. Ethan unfolded Thomas's journal beside it. For the first time, the sketches looked different. He wasn't searching for a hidden room anymore. He was looking for something that had been intentionally erased. He measured the distance between the support ribs again. 16 feet. Then another 16. Every measurement repeated with almost military precision. Thomas had written dimensions for nearly everything, except one section of the floor. The exact corner Atlas refused to leave alone. Ethan looked at the dog. "You've known all along, haven't you?" Atlas thumped his tail once. Not excited, certain. The storm cleared before sunrise. Mist drifted between the pine trees, turning the forest silver beneath the first light. After a quick breakfast, Ethan carried a shovel, pry bar, tape measure, and hammer to the corner. He tapped across the concrete. Solid, solid, solid. Then, thunk. The sound changed. Barely. A deeper echo. He froze. He struck the same place again. Thunk. Not hollow, but different. Atlas immediately stood. The German shepherd walked over and placed one paw exactly beside the spot. The same place. Every time. Ethan smiled despite himself. "Guess you were trying to tell me." He marked the area with chalk before studying Thomas's drawings one more time. No hatch, no doorway, nothing. Only a note scribbled in the margin. "Never force the first barrier. Find what unlocks it." "What barrier?" Ethan whispered. His eyes drifted across the hut. The stove, the water pipe, the steel ribs, the windows. Everything seemed ordinary. Then he noticed something he had overlooked. The gravity-fed water pipe didn't enter the hut where it logically should have. Instead, it disappeared beneath the exact section of floor Atlas guarded. He followed the pipe outside. The line disappeared beneath a cluster of moss-covered rocks. Someone had carefully stacked them decades earlier. Ethan knelt and began lifting them one by one. The final stone revealed an old shut-off valve. Unlike the one inside the hut, this valve had never rusted shut. It still turned. He hesitated. "Thomas." Slowly, he rotated it. Nothing happened. Then somewhere beneath the hut, a faint metallic click. Atlas barked. Just once. Ethan hurried inside. The sound had come from beneath the floor. He pressed his ear against the concrete. Silence. But the echo beneath it had changed. He reached for the pry bar again. This time, the edge slipped beneath a thin steel plate hidden under decades of dirt where the concrete met the wall. The plate lifted barely half an inch before stopping. Locked again. Not enough. Another puzzle. Atlas suddenly walked away from Ethan. He crossed the hut to the old cast-iron stove. He sniffed around one of its legs, then scratched the floor twice. Ethan frowned. The stove? The heavy stove hadn't been moved in years. Its legs had sunk slightly into the concrete. With considerable effort, Ethan wedged a steel pipe beneath it and pushed. The stove shifted only a few inches. A loud scraping sound echoed through the building. Underneath, hidden beneath years of ash and dust, lay a circular iron ring set flush into the floor. Ethan's pulse quickened. He cleared away the dirt. The ring wasn't attached to concrete. It belonged to a steel disc about 18 inches across. A cover. He pulled. Nothing. Locked. Again. He laughed softly. "You're making me earn this." Atlas wagged his tail. Then his ears snapped upright. The dog turned sharply toward the doorway. Low, still, listening. A truck engine. Far away. Growing louder. Not Caleb. The engine was bigger, heavier. Atlas stepped outside before Ethan could stop him. The German shepherd stood between the hut and the trail, staring toward the trees. Moments later, 3 men emerged from the forest carrying crowbars and bolt cutters. None wore uniforms, but all three wore jackets embroidered with the same familiar logo: Sloan, Timber, and Mineral. The tallest man smiled. "Morning." Ethan remained in the doorway. "This is private property. We're just retrieving company equipment." "I don't think so." The man's eyes drifted briefly toward the corner where Ethan had been working. Just for an instant. It was enough. They knew exactly where to look. Atlas stepped forward with a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. The man closest to him raised his crowbar. "Call off the dog." Ethan's voice stayed calm. "You should lower the bar first." Instead, the man lunged. Atlas sprang between him and Ethan with astonishing speed. The crowbar missed Ethan completely, but caught Atlas hard across his injured shoulder. The German shepherd cried out, stumbled sideways, then planted himself again directly in front of Ethan. His legs trembled, yet he refused to retreat. The clearing fell silent. Even the birds seemed to disappear. Ethan's eyes never left the man holding the crowbar. For the first time in years, the calm expression of a combat veteran returning to protect someone he loved settled across his face. Ethan didn't step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed himself between Atlas and the three men. Years earlier, in Afghanistan, his platoon sergeant had once told him that the calmest man in a fight was usually the most dangerous one. He remembered that now. The man holding the crowbar hesitated. Something in Ethan's posture had changed. Not anger. Control. Measured. Deliberate. "You've already crossed onto private property," Ethan said evenly. "Leave." The tallest man forced a smile. "We're just trying to avoid misunderstandings. You've got 5 seconds." Rainwater still dripped from the roof behind him. No one moved. Atlas struggled back onto all 4 feet despite the pain in his shoulder. His growl remained low. Steady. Protective. The tallest man finally raised one hand. "Let's go." None of them apologized. None of them looked defeated. As they disappeared into the trees, Ethan noticed the last man glance toward the iron ring beneath the stove. Just one glance. It confirmed everything. They knew exactly what they were searching for. Only they hadn't found it. Not yet. The moment the truck engine faded into the distance, Ethan knelt beside Atlas. The bandage had slipped. Fresh blood stained the white gauze. "I'm sorry, buddy." Atlas licked Ethan's wrist once. The dog wasn't looking at the wound. He was looking toward the stove. Again. Even injured, he hadn't forgotten. After cleaning the shoulder and replacing the bandage, Ethan sat on the floor beside the hidden steel cover. Thomas's journal rested open across his knees. He read every page mentioning water, ventilation, foundations, and emergency access. One sentence suddenly caught his attention. "Pressure protects what locks cannot." Pressure. His eyes drifted toward the water valve outside. He stood immediately. Atlas followed despite the limp. Outside, Ethan traced the spring line back to the concealed valve beneath the moss-covered stones. He closed it completely, then reopened it halfway. Nothing. Another quarter turn. Somewhere beneath the hut, metal clicked. A deep mechanical sound rolled below the concrete floor. Atlas barked sharply. Ethan hurried back inside. The circular steel cover beneath the stove had lifted just enough to reveal the edge of a recessed handle. That's it. He gripped the ring with both hands. Years of rust resisted. He pulled harder. Muscles strained. The steel disc rose several inches before sticking again. Atlas stepped beside him. Not pulling. Just standing there, as if refusing to let Ethan quit. One final effort. The cover broke free with a grinding scrape that echoed through the hut. Cold air rushed upward, not stale, cool, dry, air that had been moving. Ethan stared into the darkness. A steel ladder disappeared beneath the floor. He switched on his flashlight. The beam vanished into what looked like a narrow concrete shaft. He waited, listening. No movement. No animals. Only the faint hum of moving air somewhere below, exactly what Thomas's notes had described. Ventilation. Engineered. Intentional. Ethan looked at Atlas. "You coming?" The German shepherd stepped onto the first rung without hesitation. Together they descended. The temperature dropped noticeably. The smell changed too. Concrete, dry cedar, machine oil. Not decay, not abandonment. At the bottom, Ethan's flashlight swept across a heavy steel door standing open. Beyond it, his breath caught. Shelves, perfectly organized, floor to ceiling, rows of sealed food containers labeled by year, medical cabinets, water purification equipment, hand tools wrapped in protective cloth, solar battery banks mounted neatly along one wall, large stainless steel water tanks connected to pipes running overhead, a compact radio station carefully protected beneath dust covers. Nothing luxurious. Everything practical. Everything maintained. It wasn't a bunker built for hiding. It was a refuge built for surviving. Thomas hadn't prepared for war. He had prepared for disasters, wildfires, blizzards, floods, search and rescue emergencies. Ethan walked slowly through the room. Every shelf carried handwritten labels, blankets, medical, water, fuel, communications, emergency lighting. Whoever entered this place during the worst day of their life would immediately know where to find what they needed. Thomas had thought of everything. Atlas wandered quietly between the shelves. His tail moved gently now. Near the center of the room stood a solid oak table, one chair, one lantern, one leather folder. No gold, no stacks of cash, no treasure. Only purpose. Ethan smiled. Victor Sloan had spent months searching for something worth millions. Instead, he had overlooked something infinitely more valuable, a place capable of saving lives. Atlas stopped beside the table. He looked up at Ethan. Resting in the middle of the worn wood surface was a single cream-colored envelope. Across the front, written in careful block letters Ethan recognized from the journal, were just 3 words. For Ethan Brooks. He reached for it slowly. For the first time since entering the mountain, his hands trembled. Not from fear, not from exhaustion, from recognition. The handwriting on the envelope matched every page of Thomas Brooks's journal. Steady, deliberate, patient. Atlas sat quietly beside the table, his bandaged shoulder rising and falling with each slow breath. His eyes never left Ethan. Ethan carefully broke the wax seal. Inside rested several folded pages. At the top of the first sheet were 6 words. "If you're here, you listen to Atlas." A quiet laugh escaped Ethan. He looked at the German shepherd. "So, you really were giving orders?" Atlas answered with a slow wag of his tail. Ethan lowered his eyes to the letter again. "Ethan, if these pages are in your hands, then you ignored the easier road. That tells me you're still the same man I've watched from a distance for many years. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed family. That's a burden I'll carry wherever the Lord has taken me." Ethan stopped reading. He swallowed hard before continuing. "I followed your service through every public record I could find. Afghanistan. 3 deployments. Purple Heart." Then silence. After that came jobs that didn't last, addresses that kept changing, and eventually, no address at all. His jaw tightened. He had never told anyone in Montana about any of that. Thomas had known. Not everything. Enough. Atlas slowly rested his head against Ethan's knee. The warmth of the dog's muzzle grounded him. Ethan continued reading. People think soldiers come home when the airplane lands. Some do. Many don't. Parts of them stay somewhere far away. The words blurred, not because the ink had faded, because Ethan's eyes suddenly refused to stay dry. The room disappeared. For a heartbeat. He smelled hot dust, burned diesel, cordite, the inside of a Humvee after an explosion, someone screaming for a medic. His heartbeat accelerated. His breathing shortened. His hands instinctively searched for a rifle that no longer existed. Atlas nudged him. Once. Twice. The German shepherd didn't lick him, didn't bark. He simply leaned harder against Ethan until the room beneath the mountain slowly came back into focus. The concrete walls returned. The shelves. The lantern. The letter. Ethan closed his eyes. I'm here. The words barely escaped his lips. I'm here. Only after his breathing steadied did he unfold the next page. If you're reading this while looking over your shoulder, stop. You are no longer inside the war. Ethan froze. He read the sentence again. Then a third time. The words landed harder than any metal ever had. He folded the page halfway, looked around the shelter, listened. Nothing. Only the quiet hum of moving air through Thomas's carefully designed ventilation system. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel dangerous. It felt safe. Atlas sighed beside him and stretched out on the cool concrete floor. Ethan smiled through damp eyes. Thomas had somehow understood exactly what no therapist, employer, or caseworker ever had. He kept reading. You probably expected to find money. If that's what you hoped for, I'm sorry to disappoint you. Money disappears, skills remain, communities endure. This haven was never meant to hide wealth. It was built so that strangers caught in the worst day of their lives would find another tomorrow. Ethan slowly looked around the shelter again. Every shelf, every water tank, every blanket, every medical kit. Nothing had been arranged for comfort. Everything had been arranged to preserve life. Thomas had spent decades building something that would never make him rich, only useful. The final page waited beneath the others. One day the mountains will burn again, or snow will trap families, or hikers will disappear. When that happens, don't own this place. Steward it. Leave the door open. Teach others, because a shelter isn't measured by the walls that protect it. It's measured by the lives that leave it alive. Signed simply, Thomas Brooks. No dramatic farewell, no final speech, just a signature. Exactly like the man Caleb had described. Quiet, practical. Ethan folded the letter carefully. He didn't put it into his backpack. Instead, he slipped it inside the inner pocket of his jacket, directly over his heart. Atlas stood. His ears suddenly lifted toward the ceiling. A faint vibration echoed somewhere above them. Truck doors. More than one. Ethan immediately switched off the lantern. Darkness filled the underground room. He looked toward the steel ladder. Someone had returned to the hut, and this time, they hadn't come alone. Ethan stood motionless in the darkness beneath the hut. The faint vibration above resolved into distinct sounds. Truck doors. Boots on wet ground. Voices. More than 3. Atlas looked toward the ladder, then back at Ethan. The German shepherd's breathing had slowed despite the ache in his shoulder. His training remained stronger than his pain. Ethan switched off his flashlight completely. The underground shelter disappeared into blackness. He listened. 1, 2, 3, at least 5 different sets of footsteps. He remembered another night years earlier outside a small village in Helmand province. His squad had waited inside a mud compound while unknown men searched nearby. Back then, patience had kept everyone alive. The lesson still held. A heavy thud echoed through the floor overhead. Someone had kicked the front door open. "They've been digging," a voice said. "Check every inch." Victor Sloan. Calm, confident, much closer than before. Ethan rested one hand lightly on Atlas's neck. "Stay." The dog obeyed without hesitation. Victor's boots scraped across the concrete floor above. "You missed something," he said sharply. "I know it's here." Another man answered, "We searched everywhere. Then search again." A crowbar struck concrete. Metal rang through the underground chamber. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Ethan studied the shelter around him. Thomas had planned everything. There had to be another exit. He opened the journal one final time, turning quickly through the construction sketches. Near the back pages, hidden between plumbing diagrams, he noticed a small penciled note he had overlooked. Emergency egress, north slope. No directions. Only an arrow. He searched the rear wall until Atlas quietly stood and walked toward a shelf stacked with emergency blankets. The dog nudged the lowest shelf. Ethan pulled it aside. Behind it was a narrow steel door painted the same color as the concrete wall, hidden in plain sight. He smiled. "You really did think of everything." The latch opened silently. Beyond it stretched a low tunnel reinforced with timber beams. Fresh air drifted through from somewhere ahead. Ethan clipped Thomas's letter inside his jacket. Then he looked once more at the shelter. "I'm coming back." Atlas entered the tunnel first. The passage climbed gradually through solid earth before ending behind a cluster of fallen pines nearly 80 yards uphill from the hut. The opening was invisible unless someone stood directly in front of it. From there, Ethan could see the clearing below. Victor Sloan had brought 6 men. 2 searched inside the hut. 1 examined the water line. Another walked the tree line carrying bolt cutters. The remaining 2 unloaded gasoline cans beside a pickup. Ethan's expression hardened. "They're not looking anymore. They're destroying." Atlas let out the faintest rumble. Ethan reached into his backpack. He wasn't carrying weapons, only practical tools. Paracord, wire, small camping bells, Thomas's old signal mirror. He moved quietly through the trees, setting simple warning lines where the terrain naturally funneled movement. Nothing meant to injure, everything meant to reveal. Years in the army had taught him that seeing first often mattered more than striking first. Minutes later, the first bell chimed. One of Victor's men had walked directly into a line of nearly invisible cord. Heads turned. "Somebody's up there." Victor looked toward the ridge. "Spread out." Exactly what Ethan had hoped. The group separated, no longer watching each other's blind spots. Atlas slipped silently through the timber to Ethan's left, staying just visible enough for Ethan to track him. Suddenly, a loud cracking sound split the forest. Ethan's instincts screamed before his mind caught up. Fresh-cut wood. A tree. He looked uphill. A tall, dead pine leaned unnaturally. Its base had been almost completely sawn through. The slightest push would send it crashing across the escape route. One of Victor's men shoved the trunk. The tree began to fall. "Ethan!" Caleb's voice echoed from somewhere near the road. He had arrived with 2 volunteer firefighters after noticing Victor's trucks passing through town. Ethan stepped backward. Too late. The trunk accelerated toward him. Atlas launched forward. Ignoring the pain in his shoulder, the German shepherd slammed into Ethan's leg with all his remaining strength. The impact threw Ethan clear. The pine crashed exactly where he had been standing seconds earlier. The ground shook. Branches exploded across the hillside. For a terrifying moment, Ethan couldn't see Atlas. Atlas! He scrambled over the fallen limbs. Then he heard it. A familiar pant. The German shepherd emerged slowly from beneath a tangle of smaller branches, limping heavily but alive. Ethan dropped to both knees. He wrapped both arms around the dog without saying a word. Caleb and the firefighters reached them moments later. Victor's men were already retreating toward their trucks. One firefighter had recorded the damaged water system, the cut tree, and the gasoline cans on his phone. Victor glanced once toward Ethan. Neither man spoke. He knew the mountain had stopped being his secret. As Victor's convoy disappeared down the logging road, Ethan rested his forehead gently against Atlas's. "You saved me again." The dog answered the only way he ever had, by staying right beside him. Ethan rested his forehead against Atlas's for a long moment, before the world around them slowly returned. Caleb knelt beside the German shepherd, carefully feeling along his shoulder and ribs. "I don't think anything's broken," he said quietly. "He's going to be sore for a while." Atlas looked up as if to protest. His tail gave one slow wag. Ethan laughed under his breath. "You've never known when to quit." The firefighters helped clear the fallen pine from the trail, while another documented the damaged water line, the cut tree, and the abandoned gasoline cans. By sunset, the county sheriff had arrived to take photographs and collect statements. Victor Sloan never came back that day. Neither did his trucks. As darkness settled over the Bitterroot Mountains, the clearing grew quiet again. Only this time, the silence felt different. It no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to people who had chosen to stay. Caleb built a fire outside while the firefighters shared coffee from dented thermoses. Nobody spoke much. They didn't need to. Mountain people understood that some victories were better honored with quiet than celebration. Before leaving, Caleb placed a weathered hand on Ethan's shoulder. Thomas would have been proud. Ethan looked toward the rusted hut. "I wish I'd known him." "You do." Caleb smiled. Every board he measured, every pipe he buried, every note he wrote, he nodded toward the shelter. "You're getting to know him now." Weeks turned into months. Summer settled over the mountains. The old hut changed little by little. The patched roof became a new steel roof. The broken windows gave way to solid glass. Fresh cedar framed the doorway. The weathered walls remained rusted in places, but Ethan intentionally left some of them untouched. He wanted people to remember what the building had once been. Inside, the changes were more dramatic. The cast-iron stove burned almost every evening. A sturdy wooden table now stood where broken debris had once collected. Caleb taught Ethan how to plane rough lumber into smooth boards. Volunteer electricians from town helped safely restore basic lighting powered by the solar batteries Thomas had installed years before. The spring water flowed steadily through new pipes. The underground haven remained exactly as Thomas had left it. Nothing unnecessary, nothing wasted, everything ready. Grace Holloway visited one afternoon, carrying another small envelope. "I found this while closing your uncle's final files." Inside was a faded photograph. Thomas stood outside the same hut nearly 20 years earlier. Beside him was a young German shepherd wearing an old search and rescue harness. Ethan looked from the photograph to Atlas. "They look alike." Grace smiled. Thomas always believed good dogs taught people how to become better humans. She paused before adding quietly, "I think he was right." By early autumn, hikers occasionally stopped by asking for water. Hunters came to warm themselves beside the stove during unexpected snowstorms. One elderly couple whose truck had slid into a ditch spent an entire night inside the haven until rescue crews reached them the next morning. Word spread. Not about hidden treasure, not about secret tunnels, about kindness. People in Hamilton began calling the place Brooks Haven. The name stayed. One crisp October morning, Ethan stood outside splitting firewood while Atlas rested on the porch. The scar across the dog's shoulder had healed into a thin silver line hidden beneath thick fur. A pickup climbed slowly into the clearing. A young man stepped out. Mid-20s, army backpack, old combat boots. The look in his eyes reminded Ethan of someone, himself years ago. The young veteran hesitated before speaking. "I'm sorry to bother you. You Ethan Brooks?" "I am." "I heard—" He looked down, embarrassed. "I heard this place helps people." Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he noticed the man's hands. They trembled almost imperceptibly. Not from the cold, from something deeper. Atlas rose from the porch and walked over. The German shepherd stopped in front of the stranger, sniffed once, then leaned gently against his leg. The young veteran's shoulders relaxed. "Just a little." Ethan reached into his pocket. He pulled out the old iron key Thomas had left him. He turned it over once in his palm before placing it in the young man's hand. "You won't need this to get inside," Ethan said, "but I want you to understand what it means." The young man looked confused. Ethan smiled. "It means nobody has to earn the right to be safe." They walked together toward the hut. Behind them, Atlas trotted along the gravel path with the slow confidence of a dog who knew exactly where home was. That evening, the mountains glowed beneath a sky painted with orange and violet. Ethan sat on the porch beside Atlas, watching the last light slip behind the pines. For the first time in many years, he didn't scan the tree line every few seconds. He didn't measure escape routes. He didn't wait for danger to appear. The memories of Afghanistan had not disappeared. Some nights they still returned. Sometimes he still woke before dawn with his heart racing. But now, when that happened, he stepped outside. The cold mountain air filled his lungs. Atlas would already be waiting beside the porch. Together, they would watch the sunrise until the past loosened its grip. Thomas had never left him money. He had left him a mission, not to hide, not to survive, but to become the kind of man who could give someone else a second beginning. Ethan looked at the rusted curves of the old hut, now standing strong against another Montana winter. Most people would have driven past it without slowing down. They would have seen an abandoned building worth almost nothing. He saw something entirely different. A promise kept. A life rebuilt. A home that opened its door instead of closing it. And beside him, the faithful German shepherd who had trusted his nose long before Ethan learned to trust hope again, rested his head across Ethan's boot. Sometimes, the greatest treasure hidden beneath a forgotten place isn't gold. It's the chance to help the next lost soul find the road home. If this story meant something to you, let me know with one simple comment. Just type 1 if you believe loyalty can change a person's life. Or type 0 if you think Ethan would never have found his way without Atlas. I read as many comments as I can, and I'd truly love to know what you think. And if stories about courage, second chances, and the unbreakable bond between veterans and their loyal dogs are the kind of stories you enjoy, please subscribe and join our community. There are many more unforgettable journeys waiting just ahead, and I'd love to share the next one with you. Until next time, take care of yourself, and never underestimate the friend walking beside you.